Well, thank you for joining me. Your presence honors me, and I hope that this becomes a productive study tonight as we study Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Well, we're nearing our end of the studies in the book of Hebrews, and the author, Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. An interesting study I think we have tonight. Going to have to move quickly because we have a lot of things going on here, and there'll be a rather special exclusive for my Patreon viewers as well. And the memory text is from Hebrews 12, verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, there's a slightly different translation than the title of the lesson, finisher, perfecter. This has to do, the idea of perfection is one of maturity and completion. And so both of those meanings fit very well into this, into the verse that we're looking at here. And it's interesting, he despised the shame. The shame was of nothing as far as he was concerned. And because he's the author and finisher of our faith, he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It's a beautiful, beautiful promise, really. And that shows the perfection of our faith, because as we've seen in previous lessons, he's made us to sit down in heavenly places with him. That is perfection of our faith, that we get to rule with him. The righteous will live by faith. This is a quotation. Of course, Romans is the famous one, but he's quoting Habakkuk in that case. And here we have an interesting revisitation of that idea in Romans. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may serve what was promised. I'm sorry. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet, in a very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. Meantime, the righteous will live by faith. And interestingly enough, in this particular text, we have kind of a preview or an explanation of what that means to live by faith. What is this faith? And the answer is that it's confidence. When we talk about trusting in God, but that trusting in God means that you are confident in that God will take care of you, that he will do what he says, that he who is coming will come, that he who has promised never to forsake you will not forsake you. This is the kind of confidence that allows you to endure the hard times. Now, I say this, it's not that easy. I certainly don't find it easy to endure difficult times, but it is a way of building faith and testing our faith when this comes, building what I call crash-proof faith. And we see this in of course, in the three Hebrew worthies who said, our God is well able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. But if not, they have confidence. They can withstand that, because even if he does not rescue them, they have confidence that he will take care of them in some way they do not yet understand. And that's exactly when we get to the definition of faith. Faith is the evidence of the things not seen, the substance of things which we hope for. And so they hope for deliverance, but they hope for deliverance in a more eternal and lasting way than simply to survive the fiery furnace. They want eternal life. And so they have confidence and they're able to endure that. But if not. And so that's important to understand. And that's part of what's happening. Then you have the other part, which is he who is coming will come. That's what gives you what you confidence in. He's made these promises, whatever they are. And of course, the ultimate one that remains for us is that he will return. The ultimate one was that he would die for us, but that's been done. It's a matter of history. And so the ultimate promise remaining is that he will come. He will put an end to this world, and he will bring about a perfect world, the world for which we were originally created, the world in which death is an alien and does not exist, the death in which the world in which sorrow and suffering have no part. We feel it in this world that they should not be here, and we will. That part of the promise is that he will restore us to a world where they will not be here. The righteous will live by faith. Our faith, which manifests itself in confidence and endurance, is based on God's faithfulness. He who is coming will come. And this is the first of the key points in this lesson, that our faith is based on God's faithfulness. We can have confidence. We can endure because we know he is faithful. And I say this over and over again, but it bears repeating, that ever after the flood, and you have this rainbow that is his covenant that he'll never destroy the earth again with water, every time the picture, the throne of God is pictured in Scripture, there's a rainbow, meaning he is faithfully remembering his covenant. We may lose sight of it. We may forget about it. We may not be thinking about the flood. We may not be thinking about his faithfulness. But the minute we see him and his throne, there is this rainbow saying, I never forget my covenants, and I will always honor them. That is what gives us, part of what gives us our faith, and it makes us allows us to have endurance and in confidence. He never forgets. He never fails. And that's important. That's what we base our faith on. We can trust him because of that faithfulness. So that's true. Then we have 3 days of the lesson, and there are 3 sections of there are three heroes of faith which are mentioned. There's a whole long list of people, of course, in chapter 11, the faith chapter. But there are 3 heroes of faith that are mentioned specifically in this lesson, and I want to look at them, and there's some extra things thrown in here. The 3 heroes of faith which he mentions by name, the author of our lesson picks out by name, are Abraham, Moses, and Rahab. All right, so there are 3 heroes of faith. Now, Abraham, he doesn't use this text, but here's the point. Abraham says to Isaac, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. God will provide for himself the lamb. Abraham understands this. And we get all tangled up, and it makes perfect sense because he has only one son, and God has asked him to sacrifice it. And the lesson goes into the fact that Abraham says, hey, he gave us a son when we were past childbearing. Both my wife and I were too old, and yet he gave us a son. And even if I have to give him up in sacrifice, then God has the power to resurrect him, to bring him back to life. If he can bring a child out of those who are almost dead and beyond childbearing, then he can certainly bring us a child out of, whatever. And so when Isaac says, where is the lamb? Abraham says with perfect honesty, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And that Abraham is counting that God has honored his promise already to Abraham by giving him Isaac. And he knows that based on God's faithfulness, again, that he can trust God to protect, to resurrect if necessary, to guide, to work through Isaac as well. And so that's how the basis of his faith. Abraham understands that God is the one who's provided. If Isaac were to be the sacrifice, God would have provided that lamb too. But of course, no human beings, the death of any human being, could not possibly rescue us from sin. It had to be God as the human being, that 100% God, 100% human being who could take away the sin of the world. So Abraham speaks in faith, and it's a greater faith than he even understands. But it's a great faith that he has to even say what he does. And now I'm going to come to something, because it mentions Abraham, it mentions Moses, it mentions Rahab. And then there's, in this story of the faithful, in chapter 11 of Hebrews, there is a mention of Sarah. And this is going to be, I'm sorry, but this is slightly off topic, and this is the kind of thing I do in depth for my Patreon patrons. And that is, what about Sarah? Now, three heroes of the faith. The next one that's mentioned is Moses. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. This is a remarkable thing, because we know that in Egypt, or at least it's commonly claimed, that the royal line passed through the women. So the fact that he was Pharaoh's daughter would indicate that he would be the next Pharaoh. And certainly he was a very highly placed. He would have been, I mean, even if he had not been Pharaoh, he would have been one of the nobility. He would have had all the luxuries that ancient life could bestow. Now, it's interesting when we think about all the luxuries that ancient life could bestow. We may think, well, about King Tut's tomb and all the gold and amazing things that were buried with him. We may forget that King Tut had several serious diseases before he died, and he had a club foot, and that the ministrations, the depredations of sin had already caused havoc on the Egyptian line, especially because there was a tendency toward inbreeding, and so it would have weakened and intensified these difficulties. So, and King Tut died around age of 17. So you can talk about whatever you want to about the great things that they had, but life in the ancient world was pretty short for everybody most of the time. And here Moses, rather than accepting the life of ease that could have been his, took on a life of great struggle and eventually slight disappointment. He didn't make it to the promised land. But don't forget, he was resurrected. All right. And this is an interesting thing, because in John Milton's poem, his epic poem, he says, Paradise Lost, he says that has Satan, the character, say, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. But Moses intercedes for the children of Israel, and even at one point says, if you can't save them, blot my name out and save them instead of me. And so we have Moses here essentially saying, better to serve the God of heaven than to reign in Egypt, or to reign in this world. So it's a fascinating, I just found this a beautiful contrast between what we know was certainly legitimately the representation of Lucifer's attitude. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. The final of the three heroes of the faith that are brought forth, the final one is Rahab. And we could go on and on. He goes, the author of the lesson, and Hebrews goes on and on about Rahab in many ways. But I'm going to talk a little bit extra about Rahab myself. For the Lord your God, he is God of heaven above and on earth below. This is what she says. This is part of her testimony. In all of in the book of Joshua, very few words are spoken, but she gets most of them. She has this wonderful prophetic speech in which she prophesies about what God is going to do. And she makes this declaration this is a declaration of faith. The Lord your God. And of course, the Lord here is, as often happens in the Old Testament, the Lord here is simply a way of not having to say the name of God. The actual word in the text is Yahweh. For Yahweh, your God, he is God in heaven and earth, heaven above and on earth below. And she has a very deep understanding of this. This is an expression of faith. And what's interesting about this is, and this is from my book, For Such a Time, in essence, Rahab is the spy. Remember when they, 40 years before, they'd sent 12 spies, 2 from each tribe. And we know the names of those people. We know the names of their fathers. We know the names of their grandfathers. We know what tribes they were from. And as a result of that, when the 12 spies came back, only 2 spies were faithful, just 2. And that was Caleb and Joshua. And they're still alive because they were faithful spies. But it's interesting because in Joshua 2, which is where the story of Rahab is found, there are only 2 names. And those who have studied with me and have heard some of these things understand that in Old Testament narrative, when a character is named, they're important. Now, the king of Jericho is mentioned, but not by name. The only 2 names are those of Joshua and Rahab, and they occur in the first 2 verses of the chapter. So they're the 2 that matter. And so it says, in essence, Rahab is the spy. Instead of sending 12 spies, he sends 2 spies, which are not named. And why does he send 2 spies instead of 12? Probably because this is an indication in the narrative that the author is telling us that 2 were faithful last time. 2 are enough to do the job this time. 2 will be faithful. You will get faithful reports from these 2, as there was a faithful report from the 2 40 years earlier. But when you look at the 2 are not named, and when they come back and they report to Joshua, they simply report the words of Rahab. Because the 2 faithful ones here in Joshua 2 are Joshua and Rahab. Rahab is the spy. Everything Joshua instructed the spies to do, Rahab makes possible. She conceals them. She tells them what the morale is of the people there. She tells them how to escape, which route to take, and how to get back safely. And she simply asks that her family be saved. And they are. So what you have here is a fascinating situation where she is the faithful spy. So these 3 heroes of the faith, what do they do? What does it make why is their faith so great? Now, there are other people, obviously, in chapter 11, but these 3 are picked out by our lesson author for good reason. And what is true of them is true of the others. They trust God. That's what saving faith is. And they demonstrate that by acting in accordance with that trust. Just like the 3 Hebrew worthies who were willing to go and who were thrown into the fiery furnace. They didn't run away. Just like that, Rahab acts in accordance with her faith. She trusts, she believes there is one God, and she's going to trust that God. Abraham believes. He says, God gave me a child when it was impossible. So even if I have to sacrifice this child, maybe he'll give me that same child back, even though it seems impossible. I'll act as though I'll act in trust. I'll act as though what he says is true, that I believe it. And so that is the key point here. Moses does the same. They all act in accordance with the trust they claim to have. And that's what, again, I say this a lot, but in James, it says, show me your faith by your works. That's what he's talking about. He's not saying, here's a list of good things you can do to earn your salvation. He's saying, if you have faith, that has consequences for your behavior. So don't tell me what you believe. Show me what you believe by acting upon it. And that, of course, is the way it works. We don't do good things to be saved, but when we are saved, when we are in a loving relationship, a saving relationship, a trusting relationship with God, we will act differently. Now, I'm humbled to say that my own behavior reveals that I don't trust God nearly as much as I ought to. That sometimes my behavior is such that it shows that I don't trust God, and this is something that He and I are working on. But we all, I think, go there. Paul said, I affirm the law in my mind, but in my body I see other things happening. So I say I believe God, and I think I believe God, but at the same time I'm flesh, and I have the weaknesses of the flesh, and so I don't perform as I ought to. Thank God He has performed for me. So this then becomes the author and perfecter of our faith, Jesus. Therefore, he says, you see, I put this, I've indented this because let us also is where the main sentence begins. The sentence, the subject of the sentence is let us, we are the subject. Therefore, since, so he's simply setting up the proof. Therefore is a conclusion, and he's setting up the summary of the evidence. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, he's just gone through Hebrews 11. He's just gone through all of these fascinating people who acted in accordance with their trust in God, who demonstrated their faith by their behavior. And he's saying, we have all these examples now. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. We could have spent an hour or two minimum on this particular text. It's really a marvelous text. And I have a dialogue that I've done with my own congregation on laying aside every weight. He talked about every encumbrance here. Another translation says laying aside every weight. And I want just to notice a couple of small things here. We can't we're running out of time, don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's important to notice it at least. And that is, it says every encumbrance and the sin, because the encumbrances and the sins are not the same thing. Every encumbrance is not necessarily a sin. It may be that we have, as counselors will tell us, we have baggage. We have things that, have happened to us, traumas that have happened in the past, and they're getting in our way because we haven't dealt with them. They aren't our sins. They are the result of other people's sins, but they hinder our service because we're unable to do. I could go on about my own counseling and how much I've benefited through that. We all have these things that get in our way. And that's what he's saying. We should lay aside every encumbrance. Now, obviously, Paul isn't talking about therapy because it didn't exist back then. But we can understand this is part of systematic theology. Remember, systematic theology is what does it mean for us today? And it can be informed by science and by all sorts of things because we have learned so much. And so every encumbrance means, I need to exercise more. That would be my weight is an encumbrance. There are other encumbrances that we have, other weights that hold us back, emotional, physical, and otherwise. And he's saying, we need to diligently lay those things aside. because if we're healthier, we can witness better. Again, this is not about these being righteous acts that earn us anything, but rather because we have such a great cloud of witnesses and we have such opportunity for faith, we can see we don't have to go through. Abraham didn't have all this stuff to rely on. He heard the voice of God, but that was all he had pretty much. We have this great long history, and we know about the sacrifice of Christ. And so as a result of that, we should be grateful, and we will begin to work on those things which are in the way. They are not necessarily sins of our own. They may be sins of things that people have done to us and the results of those, but they're still weights which hold us back. And so we should try to do everything we can to get rid of these weights. And the sins. Then there are the sins. Those are the things that our failings. Those are the things which we do, the choices that we make, the falling short and all that, which they so easily entangle us. So that's the point. Let us lay aside everything that gets in our way. And if that requires exercise, I'm going to have to do that. If it requires therapy, it requires dietary change, it requires education, whatever it is that is encumbrance, that's a weight that holds us back. That's what we need to deal with. And then it says this, the race that is set before us. We have to run the race that is set before us. My race is not your race. I may have a steeplechase and you may have a sprint, or it may be the other way around, or one may have a marathon. It doesn't matter. What matters is what race is set before you. What is the race set before me? We must run the endurance with endurance the race that is set before us. We don't always have a choice in those matters, but we need to run with endurance that race that we have. We shouldn't be looking at others and saying, well, I wish I had their race, or I wish I had this, that, or I wish they had the other thing. Each of us has a race set before us. God has created us for a particular purpose, to perform a particular function in his plan. And we will be the most happy and the most joyful when we're fulfilling that. And so we need to search for that, but we need to concentrate not on, well, his race looks easy, I'd like to do that. Or her race is easier than mine, or I wish I could do this great. I want to go up Mount Everest. Maybe you need to race somewhere else. Whatever race God has set before you, that's the one that you need to endure. And maybe the endurance is, this seems pretty pedestrian. There's not much going on here. I don't understand why I have to do this thing again and again and again and again. But that's the way it works, isn't it? Each of us has a different race. And each of us only knows the race that we have. So this is a marvelous thing. The race that is set before us, no other. And Philippians 1:6 is not a text he uses, but it's important to understand. Being confident of this, is the author, he's the one who started it out. But he's also the perfecter. He's the finisher of our faith. And he's not just the finisher of our faith in the sense that he's the finisher of our doctrine or our theology or our understanding. He is the one who completes your faith. He is the one who completes my faith. And that's why I have Philippians 1:6, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. He will perfect your faith. He will bring your faith more maturity. He will help you finish your race and finish your faith. The author and finisher, the author and perfecter, not just of our faith, of the faith, but of my faith, of your faith. Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith, not just the faith. And I'll even reword that slightly. Here are the three keys for tonight's lesson. Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith as well as the faith. This is the final key, all right? And here are the three keys. Our faith manifests itself in confidence and endurance because it is based on God's faithfulness. That's where we started. Abraham's faith was based on God's faithfulness. Moses' faith was based on God's faithfulness. Our faith is always based on God's faithfulness. These heroes of the faith trusted in God and demonstrated that by acting in accordance with that trust. It is not simply to say, I believe, I assent to certain beliefs and so forth, but I'm developing a relationship with Christ. And in that relationship, I want to uphold my end. I want to be true to him. I will fail, but he will forgive me. But I want to continue striving, not to be saved, but to be worthy of the salvation he has given me, to be the kind of friend. There's an old song, I'll be a friend of Jesus. You know, he stood before in the court of Pontius Pilate, he stood without a friend. Jesus needs a friend too, and I want to be his friend. And that friendship is hard. And sometimes we fail our friends, and that's going to be true here too. But we want to act and continually, and that's with any relationship, when we fail, we want to confess it and say, I still want to be your friend. I still want to be yours. Without forgiveness, marriage isn't possible. I'll say that much. And then finally, the last key that we looked at, Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith, as well as the faith. It isn't just this overbroad, overarching theme. It isn't just theology. It isn't just Bible texts, but it is, in fact, our faith, our living faith, our saving faith. He is the author of it. He is the one who made it possible. And he will be the one who began that good work in us. He will be the finisher of our faith, too, the perfecter, the developer. Well, I hope that this has been useful to you. I hope that these lessons are of value. There are many ways to support this ministry, as I mentioned. And you'll see, of course, I provide extra study for those who are my Patreons. But we're done for this evening. Again, you can reach me at BibleJourneys@yahoo.com. And you can also find out what other things are going on and support us financially if you choose at patreon.com/BibleJourneys. We look forward to you. Of course, you can pray for us. We really like that. Click like and also share any of those things. Subscribe so that you won't miss any of these. Thank you for being with me. And I hope that in a few days that we can embark on another Bible journey together. Until then.